Hello. Today we're going to talk about Islam. Now, we've been talking about the fate of the Western Roman Empire, and until the mid-7th century, the Mediterranean world had remained in the hands of the heirs to the Roman Empire. Things weren't peaceful, there was no political unification of the territory, but at least there was a common religion, Christianity, and a common heritage, a classical past shared throughout the Mediterranean world by the warriors who'd conquered the West and other areas. In the mid-8th century, though, Islam is going to expand very far and very quickly. It will spread beyond the Byzantine Empire, which we'll be talking about, into North Africa and Spain. Islam established control over what had been the southern part of the Roman Empire, and it expanded even further into the east, conquering what is now India. So, what is Islam and how did it rise? Well, at its root, it was very similar to Christianity and Judaism. Islam is a monotheistic religion derived in part from Judaic and Christian beliefs. The new element in Islam was the belief in another great prophet, Muhammad, the last and greatest prophet sent from God to mankind. So who was Muhammad? Well, he was an Arab, born on the peninsula of Arabia in the city of Mecca, around 570 AD. We know that he was a successful caravan manager and that he was very religious all of his life, but that when he was 40 years old, he had a special revelation. Now, it's known that monotheistic beliefs, both Christian and Jewish, had penetrated the Arabian Peninsula. But most Arabian people still believed in polytheistic religions. There were just numerous gods and goddesses that they worshipped. But there was a definite Judeo-Christian presence in Arabia at this time, and it's possible that Muhammad might have been influenced by these beliefs. When he was 40, he had a vision in which the angel Gabriel came to him with divine revelations. What had happened was that Muhammad was bothered by what he considered to be idol worship, by people praying to the various statues representing gods. And so he used to go out into the desert, into a cave, and he'd meditate and he'd pray. And it was one of those times when he's visited by the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel told Muhammad to preach that Allah was the supreme God, the one God in heaven. Allah was the same God as the God of the Jews and the Christians, just called another name. Islam believes that the truth of Allah was only revealed to Muhammad, that only a partial truth had been revealed to Jews and Christians before. And now, with the coming of Muhammad, the final truth is revealed. Moses and Jesus were held to be great prophets, sacred people sent by God to teach mankind the proper way to worship. But Islam rejected that Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus was just as human as Moses and Muhammad. He just carried a divine message. And the idea was that anyone who worships Jesus beside the one God is confused and not worshiping properly the one great God. So in Islam, there's no Holy Trinity, no separate natures. The fundamental element of Islam is that there is but one God and Muhammad is his prophet. Muhammad is recognized as a great prophet whose teaching should be followed, but he is not worshipped. So Islam just reiterates the monotheistic Judeo-Christian beliefs, but saying that Muhammad is his prophet emphasizes the difference, that Muhammad is the greatest and final prophet. Well, eventually, Muhammad's teachings were written down in what came to be known as the Quran, the recitation or recitations of Muhammad, reciting the divine message that had been communicated to him. The idea was that the only way to live a proper life was to be a subject of Allah and to live according to His wishes. In fact, the word Islam means subjection to Allah. At first, Muhammad had just a few followers, but he started to gain followers, and as he did, he encountered a lot of official hostility to his teachings. In fact, his first convert was his wife. And as I said, he starts to make enemies. And one reason for this is that the town in which he lived, Mecca, was a thriving trade center. So a lot of people came through this city to trade. And while they were there doing business, they would go to a shrine where the various statues of the gods were housed, and they would pray to these gods. And they brought their money with them. So when people begin to converting to Islam, that means they're no longer worshiping these gods and paying money that eventually goes into the city. And also, Muhammad was an Arab, but at first Islam seemed to be just a strange cult. And the civil leaders were very hostile to Muhammad, just as the Jewish authorities were to Jesus. They were hostile to his followers, and they persecuted them and eventually drove them out of Mecca. So who were the Arabs? Well, here you see a map, and the shaded area is the area we're talking about, the Arabian Peninsula. And the Arabs were a Semitic people, and they had been living in the Arabian Peninsula for many centuries. Some lived in towns like Mecca and Medina, but most lived nomadic lives in desert tribes and oases in the desert. There was no organizing political force. Instead, what they had was tribal loyalty and loyalty to their clan. A lot of different Arab clans occupied the region during Muhammad's lifetime. These people who lived in the desert were, for the most part, nomadic herders, or Bedouins as they were called, and they adapted to the conditions of the desert very well. Using camels, they crossed and recrossed long stretches of blistering sandy desert in search of seasonal pasture lands. And in this rugged environment, the Bedouins developed a strong tradition of hospitality and generosity toward travelers. At the same time, they acquired a strong sense of clan solidarity, and raids on scarce grazing territories led to a lot of warfare between them. Well, the Bedouins would form the backbone of the armies that conquered a huge empire in the 600s and 700s. Well, the Bedouins regularly traded with other Arabs who had settled in oasis towns like Mecca, and this trade helped to support a thriving economy. Like I said earlier, Mecca was a bustling market town at the crossroads of two main caravan routes, and it was also a thriving pilgrimage center. So here you see the Arabian Peninsula, and here you see the city of Mecca, where Muhammad is from. From all over the Arabian Peninsula, Arabs came to pray at the Kaaba, which was an ancient shrine. Now, during Muhammad's time, before he had his revelations, this was a shrine that housed all these idols I mentioned, and it's thought that there were maybe about 360 in there, possibly one for almost every day of the year. Later, once the people begin to convert to Islam, it will be considered to be a very holy shrine to Allah. And in fact, today it's considered to be the most sacred spot in Islam. And that's why Muslims pray facing Mecca, because they're praying facing the Kaaba. And I've read that there was even the belief at one point that early on that another reason it was holy was because it was thought that it was built by Abraham. Well, whatever the case may be, like I said, it's here that all these statues were housed that bothered Muhammad. Alright, so what happens? Well, as I said, Muhammad begins to have visions. He was troubled by all the idol worship of the Arabs, by the moral problems in society, went out in the desert to pray and meditate, and here's the angel Gabriel. Has his vision. At first he's terrified and puzzled, but his wife encourages him to accept the call and becomes his first convert. And then he devotes the rest of his life to spreading Islam. He urged people to give up their false gods and submit to the one true God. And people listened to him. He began to gain converts, but his rejection of the traditional Arab gods angers the Meccan merchants because it's disrupting the pilgrimage trade and they're losing money. So, in 622, faced with the threat of murder, Muhammad and his followers left Mecca for a city that became known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. And they're actually fleeing across the desert to Medina, and this journey is a very important point in Islamic history. It's known as the Hijra, the flight across the desert is, and the year 622 becomes the first year of the Muslim calendar. It's a real turning point for Islam because as he's traveling across the desert to Medina, Muhammad continues to preach and to gather followers. And like I said, the Bedouins just had this tradition of hospitality, so he's welcomed by all of these people he encounters. And so as he makes his way across the desert, he's basically amassing an army of new converts. Well, he gets to Medina, and people there had heard of him. They were familiar with his work, and in fact there were already converts there, and they welcome him as a ruler and a lawgiver as well as God's prophet. He was held in great respect and appointed a judge in Medina. The simplicity and fervor of his appeal really impressed these tribal people. And as his reputation continued to grow, thousands of Arabs adopted Islam. From Medina, Muslims launched attacks on Meccan caravans and defeated the Meccans in battle. And finally, in 630, Muhammad returned in triumph to Mecca, where he destroyed the idols in the Kaaba. And it's at this point that he becomes the most important political as well as religious leader in Arabia. And he'll spend the next 2 years working to unite the Arabs. His leadership marks the beginning of a religious revolution used to unite the Arabian tribes in a way that had never been done before. Allegiance to the new religion was used to overcome tribal and family loyalties and loyalties to other gods. Muhammad united different factions and tribes under his own leadership. He also began to attract more prosperous urban Arabs, and ultimately Islam is going to appeal to non-Arabs as well. But during Muhammad's lifetime, the religion was pretty much restricted to Arabia and to mostly Arabic people. But during his lifetime, Islam spread throughout most of Arabia. So here you see Arabia during his lifetime. You see the locations of Mecca and Medina, and you see the caravan route. And these traveling caravans will be very important because they will carry the idea of Islam. They'll carry the word and spread it throughout the peninsula. So as I said, the Hijra in 622, Muhammad's flight across the desert from Mecca to Medina, a huge turning point for the religion because it's really from this point that the religion begins to grow and spread very, very quickly. And it's for that reason that it becomes, that 622, the year of the Hijra, becomes the first year of the Muslim calendar. And here you see Arabia and the spread of Islam during Muhammad's lifetime. He died in 632, and you can see that upon his death, pretty much the whole peninsula has converted to Islam. And I'll be talking in a moment about the spread of Islam after his lifetime, but you can look at this map and see how far and how quickly it's going to spread. They're going to create an empire. Well, Muhammad died in 632, and his death plunged his followers into grief. Abu Bakr was one of his good friends and a very early convert to Islam. And he told the faithful, if you worship Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. If you worship God, God is alive. And Islam ultimately will survive the death of its prophet. Abu Bakr will be elected the first caliph or successor to Muhammad. The caliph became the supreme leader of the Islamic religion, and there was only supposed to be one caliph at a time. The caliph continued to lead the political and religious movement, which soon controlled not just Arabia but surrounding territory, and they swept out to begin a conquest of the Near East. And one thing that Abu Bakr did that's really important is that many of the Bedouin chiefs withdrew their loyalty from Islam once Muhammad died. And again, Abu Bakr reminded them that it's not really Muhammad they're worshiping God. And even though Muhammad has passed away, God is still there and very much alive. And so they gave their support again, and he kind of united Islam on a much surer footing, a firmer foundation. And here you see the map again, and you see the spread of Islam under the first four caliphs, the lighter green area beyond the borders of Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Persia, Armenia. So within 29 years after Muhammad's death, it spread this far. Well, like Judaism and Christianity, Islam is based on strict monotheism. Muslims believe in one all-powerful, compassionate God whose name in Arabic is Allah. Islam also teaches that people are responsible for their own actions. Whoever strays bears the full responsibility for straying, states the Quran, the sacred text of Islam. So again, the Quran is the sacred text of Islam, and it contains the recitations of Muhammad, those divine revelations given to him by the angel Gabriel. Islam believes that each individual will stand before God on the final judgment day and, depending on his or her actions, face either eternal punishment in hell or eternal bliss in paradise. Muslims recognize no official priests who mediate between the people and God. In fact, the demands of Islam are pretty simple, and all Muslims accept 5 basic duties, known as the 5 pillars of Islam or the 5 pillars of faith, starting with a declaration of faith. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. There's an obligation to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. There's an obligation to observe the holy month of Ramadan and fast from sunrise to sunset. And Ramadan is when the Quran was sent from heaven. There's an obligation to visit Mecca at least once in your lifetime, a pilgrimage or Hajj. And the obligation to give alms or charity to the poor and to avoid the arrogance of wealth. Now, these were strong but simple rules to follow. Anyone could understand them. The rules of Islam were less ritualistic and complex than the rules of Christianity. There were no priests through whom you were supposed to channel your religious efforts. In Islam, there's a direct relationship between the individual and Allah. And, at least early in the history of Islam, there was also a lack of distracting disputes or heresies, such as those that preoccupied the Christian world. There were no rebel prophets teaching different messages, which had been a Hebrew problem. Islam was a direct and intense faith, and very successful in converting people. And that was a major goal, to convert people to Islam. Like I said, when Muhammad died, Abu Bakr faced an immediate crisis. The loyalty of some Arab tribal leaders had been just dependent on Muhammad's personal command, and they now withdrew their loyalty for the Muslim state. Abu Bakr's most important contribution is to reunify the Arabs on a firmer base of loyalty to Islam itself. And then these reunited forces embarked on a remarkable military campaign. The warlike energies of the fierce Arabic tribes were to be directed to the outside so that internal fighting would stop and the power of Islam would be expanded. And in less than 150 years, Islam would spread from its origins in Arabia across Southwest Asia and North Africa and into Europe. So why and how did Islam spread so quickly? Well, its success came from the military strength of the recently unified Bedouin and Oasis Arabs. They formed a new tribe based on religion, and they made a very effective fighting unit. Islamic armies also benefited from a new attitude towards religious warfare. Muslims believed that Allah had called for a holy war, a jihad, to defend the faith. Warriors fought with extra zeal and energy in this cause because they believed that to die in a jihad brought salvation and entry into paradise. The expansion of Islam also drew strength from the kind attitude of the Muslim conquerors. Christians and Jews were considered to be people of the book because they all believe in the early part of the Bible. And they were allowed to believe and pray as they liked. They had only to pay taxes to the Muslim rulers. And a lot of Christians, especially in places like Syria and Egypt and North Africa, they had rejected the policies of what had become some pretty oppressive Byzantine emperors, and so they willingly tolerated Islam. Then there's language. Because at that time the Quran was not to be translated, believers of Islam had to learn Arabic. So Arabic became the language of business and government and literature in Islamic strongholds. Another unifying force was law, and it was administered by Muslim judges. The Muslim trade network that extended from India to the Mediterranean united the Arabic world, or the Islamic world as well. It introduced banking techniques, things like checks and so forth, that were used throughout the Islamic world. So why did the Arabs have such an astonishing series of victories? Well, another reason was the weakness of the Byzantine and Persian empires. These longtime rivals had pretty much fought each other to exhaustion. And a lot of people in the Fertile Crescent welcomed the Arabs as liberators from harsh Byzantine or Persian rule. And also contributing to the Arab success were some pretty bold and efficient fighting methods. The Arab camel and horse cavalry, with generations of experience in desert warfare, mounted some really aggressive and mobile offenses that overwhelmed more traditional armies. But maybe the main reason for Arab success was the common faith Muhammad had given his people. Islam welded a patchwork of tribes into a determined, unified state. Belief in the holiness of their faith and certainty of paradise for those who fell in battle just spurred the Arab armies to victory. Then there's the concept of jihad, a holy war, or striving in the way of God. At first, the goal was not necessarily the conversion of conquered people, but the idea was to make them pay taxes and submit to the political authority of Islam. And doing this, the advancing Arabs were able to bring a lot of people under their rule. Jews and Christians had a kind of a special status in the conquered territories because they were considered to be partially enlightened. They still had to submit politically, but they paid smaller taxes and were not compelled to give up their faith. So it's a myth that at that time the people were killed if they refused to convert to Islam. And a lot of nomadic people in North Africa and Central Asia chose Islam immediately. The message was just really easy to understand. It was simple and direct, and they saw its triumph as a sign of God's favor. Another thing, like I said, it was just an easy religion to understand. There was no religious hierarchy or class of priests. In principle, It emphasized the equality of all believers, regardless of race, sex, class, or wealth. Islam was not just a spiritual movement. It was closely tied to the uniting of the Arabic people. It was an Islamic ruler's duty to enforce the law of the Quran on his people. There was no separation of religious and political authority. The caliph was the supreme ruler on both fronts. And we see this today in the modern world. There seems to be a tendency in some parts of the Middle East to have really extreme religious regimes and, ruled by one person. Well, soon after the death of Muhammad, we start to see some expansion. There began to be a common Islamic empire which stretched from Egypt into Persia and later into North Africa and Spain. And over the centuries, as the advance of Islam was checked, the zeal to expand and conquer new territories lessened, and these became peaceful kingdoms. Also, many more non-Arabs became Muslim. It was a very attractive religion, and it became the religion of the ruling elite, which was enough to attract a lot of people to the Islamic faith. Over time, non-Islamic people became co-equal to Islamic people. Also, not long after Muhammad's death, divisions arose within Islam over his successor. The split between Sunni and Shiite Muslims had a profound impact on later Islamic history. The Sunnis felt that the caliph should be chosen by the leaders of the Muslim community. Although they agreed that the caliph should be a pious Muslim, they viewed him simply as their leader, not as a religious authority. The Shiites, on the other hand, argued that the only true successors to the Prophet were descendants of Muhammad's daughter and son-in-law. His daughter's name was Fatima, and his son-in-law was Ali. The Shiites believed that the descendants of the Prophet were divinely inspired, whereas the Sunnis believed that the inspiration came from the example that Muhammad set during his lifetime. Well, his son-in-law Ali becomes the fourth caliph, but in 661 he was assassinated in a struggle for leadership. Later, his son also was killed, and he was a Shiite, and many other Shiites died in battle against the Sunnis, trying to install their candidates for caliph. And so Ali was a Shiite who was assassinated by a Sunni. And over time, what happens is that the Shiites begin to admire martyrdom as a demonstration of their faith. Like the schism between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians that we'll be talking about in a few weeks, the division between Sunni and Shiite Muslims survived for more than 1,300 years. Members of both branches believe in the one true God, look to the Quran for guidance, and make the Hajj to Mecca. But numerous differences have emerged in areas of like religious practice and law and daily life. Traditionally, the Sunnis have been the majority branch within Islam. The Shiite movement itself has split into several different factions. Well, after the death of Ali at the hands of the Umayyad family, this family, the Umayyads, sets up a dynasty that will rule the Islamic world until 750. From their capital at Damascus in Syria, they directed some spectacular conquests that will carry Islam from the Atlantic to the Indus Valley. Even as victories expanded their empire, though, the Umayyads faced a lot of problems. First, these are desert people, and they had to adapt from desert life to ruling large cities and huge territories. To govern their empire, they often relied on local officials, including educated Jews, Greeks, and Persians. As a result, Byzantine and Persian traditions of government influenced Arab rulers. While conquest continued, a lot of wealth flowed into Umayyad hands. When conquest slowed in the 700s, economic tensions increased between wealthy Arabs and those who had left. or I'm sorry, had less. A lot of Muslims criticized the court at Damascus for abandoning the simple ways of the early caliphs. And if you remember, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is to avoid the arrogance of wealth. But the problem here is that you've got these caliphs who are not doing that. They're living in luxury. And also, the Shiites really despised the Umayyads because they had defeated Ali, killed him, and killed his son, and in their eyes dishonored the Prophet's family. There was also a lot of unrest festering among non-Arab converts to Islam because under the Umayyads they had fewer rights. Well, discontented Muslims soon found a leader in a man by the name of Abu al-Abbas, and in 750 he captured Damascus. Soon after, one of his generals invited members of the defeated Umayyad family to a banquet, and then killed them all. Only one of them escaped, and he headed to Spain, where he set up an independent caliphate in Cordoba. Abu al-Abbas then founded the Abbasid dynasty, and it's going to last until 1258. The Abbasid dynasty ended Arab dominance and really helped to make Islam a truly universal religion. Under the new Abbasids, the empire of the caliphs reached its greatest wealth and power, and Islamic civilization enjoyed a golden age. For example, Islamic culture was really very highly advanced. Contacts with the Byzantine Empire and Persia taught Arabs a lot about art and architecture, and intellectually the Islamic conquerors adopted much of what they found. For example, the writings of Aristotle were highly respected, translated into Arabic and discussed. Arabic numerals were used, and algebra, and those are among some of the Arabic inventions and advancements in science and mathematics. Well, as the 1200s drew to a close, the Arab Empire had fragmented and fallen. Independent Muslim caliphates and states were scattered across North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East. And sadly, after 5 centuries, Islam was as politically divided as the Christian world. But even though the empire crumbled, Islam continued to link diverse people across an enormous area. And in the future, other great Muslim empires will arise in the Middle East and India.